Hey guys, it's Will, and I'm going to be doing another sports history lesson today. So, this one is on my favorite sports moment in history, my bad. And I'm actually wearing the shirt, Miracle on Ice, is what we're going to be talking about today. And some little fun facts is that I actually got to go to Lake Placid, New York, and see the arena where this all happened. It was a hockey, as you can tell probably from the ice, that happened in the 1980 Winter Olympics. So, this is back in the Olympics when no professional players were allowed, so it had to be all amateurs. So the U.S. used a lot of college hockey players, so all these guys were really young, while the Soviet Union, they're now Russia, so it's kind of like the same thing. So the Soviet Union, they used amateur players who their jobs was basically hockey, but they were employed by the Soviet military. So they said, oh, we're in the military, but they spent all their time training for hockey. So they were basically a professional team, and a lot of other countries protested it and were like, hey, they're using professionals, these aren't amateurs. And Olympics did nothing about it, so they went, and so they were just dominant, and nobody gave a bunch of college kids from the United States a chance. We'll see what happens. So I'm going to talk about each of the teams a little bit, then I'm going to talk about the Olympics, and then the Miracle on Ice. So, the U.S. team was made up, as I said, of a bunch of college kids. So, the average age was actually 21 years old. So, they were very, very young, considering, because usually they were, a little bit older, maybe. But no, these guys were all college-age kids. Their coach was Herb Brooks, who's one of the greatest hockey coaches of all time. There's a ton of arenas named after him. And he kind of had a weird style of coaching that he did. He did a lot of conditioning, and so they were really in shape from just skating back and forth and back and forth. And he also preached physicality and checking and using your body to get the puck instead of just using your stick and getting a lot of penalties. And so he coached at the University of Minnesota before he got this job. And so on his team, he had 9 players from the University of Minnesota. But he also looked to Massachusetts, which is another big hockey state. And he took 4 players from Boston University. Now, this kind of sparked some controversy because the University of Minnesota and Boston University were huge rivals at the time. And so those players, in the months of training leading up to the Olympics, they didn't get along very well at first, and then they just kind of gelled in. So everyone was kind of curious how it was going to work out with all these Boston players and all these U of M players. So part of his selection process at tryouts was obviously skating, weightlifting, all that stuff, to see how physically in shape they were. He also wanted to see how far he could push them mentally. And so he handed out a 300-question psychology evaluation. And if you didn't complete it, you were automatically disqualified from the team. So this packet was about that thick. And they said it was like, a policeman stops you and you know you did nothing wrong. What do? And it was 300 of those to see if mentally the players could handle the pressure and the stress of going on the world's biggest stage at the time, the Olympics. And so they were all amateurs. And Herb Brooks, he, the psychology evaluation, his physical and conditioning, he pushed his players very hard. And there's actually a quote from a player named John Harrington, whose nickname was Bah, just B-A-H. I don't know, it's just his nickname. And he said he knew exactly where to quit. He'd push you right to the limit where you were ready to say, I've had it, I'm throwing it in, and then he'd back off. So this just shows how great of a motivator and coach he was, because he had the strategies down, he knew exactly how to play the game of hockey to beat the Soviet Union, and he also knew how to coach his players to get to their max level of production. Now, moving on to the Soviet Union, as I said before, they were amateur players when really they were professional hockey players just without the title. And they had a stacked team. None of them played in the NHL. Well, a couple of them later went to play in the NHL, but they still had 6 Hall of Famers, people who were in the Hockey Hall of Fame, on that team at that time, led by the 2 arguably best players in their position at the time. They had a right wing named Boris Mikhailov, who was considered the best player in the world, and also their goalie, Vladislav Chidiac, was one of the greatest goalies of all time. He was one of the quotes is Herb Brooks said, if you score in Chidiac, keep the puck. It doesn't happen often. So he was insane. And so they had 4 Hall of Famers other than those two even. And earlier, like before the Olympics, just to show how good they were, they faced the NHL All-Star team. So considered the best players in the world, and they beat them 6-0. So they took the best players in the world and destroyed them, didn't let them score once, and they scored 6 goals on them. So this was kind of scary for the U.S. team, because they're a bunch of college kids watching probably the people that they looked up to in the NHL getting beat 6-0 by the team that they're going to have to face in the coming Olympics. So since 1960, which is when the U.S. last won the gold medal for hockey in the Olympics, the Soviets won the next 4 straight. And they were 27-1-1. So they tied one game and lost one game, but they won every single other game that they had done. So they were on top of the world. Everyone had picked them to win. There was going to be no question. It was going to be them winning gold, Czechoslovakia winning silver, and then it was kind of muddled on who was going to get the bronze. But those two were set in stone. They're like, those are the 2 teams that are getting the gold and silver. This is what's going to happen. So in the Olympics, once they get there, there's 2 different groups, and the U.S. is in one, and the Soviet Union is in the other one. The one that the U.S. is in is considered the better pool, because there's more teams that are more closely competitive, whereas the Soviets had Soviet Union, Finland, and then a bunch of countries that really didn't stand a chance against those 2 countries. So the U.S., they went in and they faced the number 3 team in the world, Sweden, and they were down 2-1 with about 2 minutes left, and they pulled their goalie, Jim Craig, and they got an extra skater, and the guy scored a goal in the last seconds to tie it 2-2. So they tied their first game against the number 3 team in the world. Remember, these guys weren't given a chance. Like they were like, oh, they're going to lose all their games right away. They might win one against Norway. That was the only game that they were picked to like win. Then they went up against Czechoslovakia, who, like I said, was picked to like slated at silver. They beat them 7-3, so they completely destroyed them, and they were considered to be the second best team in the world. So this kind of got people thinking like, they might be doing something special here. Then they went against Norway. They beat them 5-1. Everyone was like, yeah, it was kind of expected. They beat Romania, who was decent. They're about the same level as the U.S., everyone thought. They beat them 7-2, so the same thing as they beat Czechoslovakia. And they went on to beat West Germany, who's another team that they were like kind of even with, 4-2. Now, their games were blowouts, but they were also very highly competitive. Whereas the Soviet Union, on their side, not so much. They kind of just went through and just easily glided past every team. They had one competitive game, but their scores were they beat Japan 16-0. They beat the Netherlands 17-4. They beat Poland 8-1. The only close game was against Finland, and that was 4-2. And they beat Canada 6-4. And so all of this like builds up, and 2 teams from each pool go into the medal round, which is like this round robin where you face 2 teams. You face the other teams from the other pool. And so the 2 teams from the U.S.'s pool was them and Sweden made the medal round. And then it was Finland and the Soviet Union. And everyone was like, who's going to play who first? And it came out that the U.S. was going to play the Soviet Union in the first game. So this was like peak anticipation. Everyone wanted to see if a bunch of young guys could beat the greatest team in the world. I saw one comparison that said it's like taking a high school football team and going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers at the time, who, if you know anything about football, they were like winning every Super Bowl back in this time. And so they said they have no chance of beating these guys. Also, before the Olympics, the U.S. and the Soviets had played an exhibition game, and the Soviets had won that 9-0. So and this was 3 days right before the Olympics, and so nobody gave them a chance. They're like, this is over. U.S., well, they made it to the medal round. They might get the bronze. So they go into the game, and first period comes around, it's 2-2. So they're keeping it really close. They scored like within the last second of the game. The clock actually showed 0, and everyone was arguing it, but it went in before it struck 0, and so they ended the period tying it 2-2. Second period, going into it, like I mentioned, Vladislav Tretiak was the best goalie in the world. They switched him out for their backup goalie. So they put the best goalie in the world on the bench because he let in 2 goals in 1 period, which like isn't very good, but it's also not horrible. And so they put in Vladimir Mishkin was their backup goalie. He didn't allow a goal in the second period, and the Soviets scored once. They were up 3-2. So, going into the third period, the U.S. was still just kind of playing that physical. They were checking them. They were trying to get the puck. They were shooting a lot of shots. And eventually, they tied the game 3-3. And then about 3 shifts later, this guy named Mike Eruzione comes skating in through the middle, and he gets a perfect pass right away. And the goalie was getting blocked by one of his own defenders, and he shot the puck, and it went in, and everything went crazy. The whole team cleared the bench and surrounded Eruzione in the corner. But there was still 10 minutes left on the clock. So Herb Brooks was standing on the bench, walking back and forth, yelling, "Play your game." Don't stop hitting them. Don't back off and be defensive. Keep attacking them. And so the final buzzer went off. And with that, Al Michaels, who's a sports commentator, made one of the most iconic statements of all time. He said, "Do you believe in miracles?" And then as the buzzer went off, he yelled, "Yes." And just exploded. One of the most iconic pictures in history is of all the U.S. team celebrating. And so everyone was it was amazing. But there was one thing about the game. They didn't win the gold medal by winning that game. They still had one game to play. And if they would have lost against Finland, they might not even have gotten a medal at all. And so they go into this next game against Finland. Going into the third period, they're losing 2-1. So they're like, crap, if we don't win this, we don't even get a medal. And so they came back in the third period, scored 3 goals and won 4-2. So they won the gold medal. And so nobody expected them to even get to the medal round, much less win the gold medal. It's a bunch of college kids who had never played together, and they were given no chance. But they came together, and they beat the greatest hockey team in the world. So, this is my favorite hockey moment, favorite sports moment even. I watched this movie. There's a movie on it called Miracle. It's on Netflix. Go and watch it. I watch it so much. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I can quote the entire movie pretty much. And yeah, so that's the Miracle on Ice. I hope you enjoyed this hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed making it. Have a great day.